If you have followed this channel in any capacity over the years, you'll know that I tend to gravitate towards and specialise in looking at horror media. As a real lover of that genre, I've naturally come across some pretty extreme movies. Movies that disturbed me, that made me uncomfortable, that at times hurt to watch. Whether it was the hollow sensation that washed over me when the credits of 2022's See No Evil rolled, the skin-crawling fourth wall breaks of funny games that made you complicit in the film's cruelty, the slow, drawn-out violence of Takashi Miike's Audition, or even just a real heartbreaking ending like the one that closes out the film adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist, I have had no small share of feel-bad experiences within the genre. Horror is often horrific after all. Recently though, I experienced a movie that even for my horror diet-trained stomach might have been just a bit too much. A film so deeply distressing in its subject matter and execution that when it was over, I just had to sit in silence for a while, and even though I watched it a good couple of months ago now, I have not stopped thinking about it since. And the real kicker is, unlike most of the extreme cinema I've seen, this one is not classified as a horror. It's a comedy. But I promise you, I wasn't laughing. Content warning, and I am really serious on this one. I'm going to heavily discuss the subject matter of this film, and it may be extremely upsetting to some. Unfortunately, giving the content warning also kind of gives away the real gut punch I'm going to build up to. So if you want to go into this film or this video blind, please skip to here. But if you feel like you need warning about what I am actually going to talk about, then I'm going to give a quick content warning in 3, 2, 1. This film features an act of accidental and fatal violence inflicted upon an infant child. Throughout this video, the act will be implied, but not shown. However, if this does not seem like something you would like to hear discussed, then that is totally understandable and acceptable if you wish to turn off the video now. I'm now going to return to the normal video. La Mesita Del Comedor, a Spanish film which literally translates to the small dining room table, is probably the most harrowing watch I have ever sat through. Released in English-speaking territories under the title of simply The Coffee Table, and directed by Kay Casas and written by Casas and Cristina Barobia, The Coffee Table is probably the most affecting horror movie that technically isn't a horror movie, though I'd argue it should definitely be considered one. You might be wondering how a quote-unquote comedy movie with such a mundane title as The Coffee Table could ever amount to anything close to what I am describing. How could a film about an everyday piece of furniture possibly be anything but humdrum and boring after all? With a title like that, you'd be forgiven for expecting a kind of middling European satire about the banality of consumerism or some such thing. Not the kind of torturous 91 minutes I'm describing. But that's just the thing with The Coffee Table. It embraces that mundanity. The film is a direct assault on the trivial, on the dull everyday, on the tiresome nothings that construct so much of our lives by taking one of those unimportant events and creating a small butterfly effect that leads to a seemingly insignificant purchase becoming the most important action in our lead characters' lives. And suffice to say, it's not in a good way. To sum up the premise real quick, the film opens with new parents Jesus and Maria at a furniture store with a pretty sleazy salesman. Jesus takes a liking to a rather tacky glass coffee table, one held up by statuettes of topless women, which the store clerk promises is of such a premium quality as to be completely unbreakable. Maria doesn't believe his claims, nor see the appeal of such a garish table, but that only makes Jesus want it more as the pair squabble over not just the coffee table, but elements of their relationship in general, and Jesus feels in some way that his masculinity is being challenged from Maria making all of the decisions. The unhappy couple part as Maria leaves with their baby, at which point Jesus, egged on a little by the aforementioned sleazy salesman, makes the expensive purchase in her absence almost as an act of defiance. The trivial mundanity continues as we watch the couple continue to bicker over the new purchase while Jesus assembles it. During the building process, he finds that he has a screw missing and cannot complete the table, and he places the glass panel upright against its stand while he calls the salesman for a new screw, arguing with him to deliver it while the salesman is suggesting he should come collect. Up to this point, Everything in the film so far paints a picture of a pretty unexceptional day for an unexceptional bickering couple. They go furniture shopping, they lightly snap at each other in annoyance and frustration, they experience minor inconveniences, and they plan for a dinner party later for Jesus' visiting brother Carlos and his new partner. Just a normal, maybe slightly below average boring day. The only oddness that breaks up the whole monotony of it all occurring when their 13-year-old upstairs neighbour Ruth visits and expresses a childish and problematic crush on Jesus, threatening to come clean to Maria about their relationship that only actually exists in her head if Jesus doesn't break up with Maria first. Besides the additional uncomfortable stress of rebuffing a young girl's unwanted advances, however, nothing makes this day any different from the kind of unremarkable sequence of events you or I might have experienced at some point. But that, of course, is about to change. As Maria goes shopping for the dinner party, Jesus is left alone with their baby, who begins to cry. He picks the child up and paces the room back and forth, rocking and bouncing him gently while trying to calm him. But there's this overwhelming feeling that something horrendous is about to happen. The shot is framed at the end of a hallway, the camera slowly tracking forward as Jesus and the baby enter and exit the visual of the doorframe in the distance. We creep closer and closer, the slow tracking movement feeling like it is building to something, and all of a sudden, your stomach sinks. No, surely they won't. But they do. The baby cries out, Jesus continuing to speak to him playfully as he gently bounces him, appearing and disappearing out of frame again and again. It's to no avail. The baby keeps crying and crying and crying, and then glass smashes, and the crying suddenly stops. As the audience, we sit there, staring at the empty doorframe, the sudden silence feeling like the loudest, most shocking jump scare. We see nothing. We can only speculate on what's happened, imagining the worst, and then our suspicions are confirmed. We cut to Jesus, hands and body bloodied, broken glass, and a long streak of red drawing a line to underneath a sofa on the floor beneath him. Though we never see what happens, the reaction and aftermath tells us all the awful truth we need to know. Jesus has accidentally decapitated his infant son. This unbelievably dark and horrendous moment is the real inciting incident of this movie, and what follows is the remaining 60 to 70 minutes or so of a terrified Jesus completely unable to go through the pain of having to tell Maria what has happened and trying to hide this inevitable discovery from her. It is such a devastating, awful and affecting gut punch that completely 180s the whole film, from being a dull fly-on-the-wall examination of a stressful and demanding but realistic relationship dynamic of new parents to being the single most tense and anxiety-inducing visual experience you will ever come across. Every single scene that follows this moment genuinely has the capacity to make you feel physically sick. Within storytelling, there's a narrative device known as the ticking clock. This is when writers implement a scenario where a time limit is placed upon characters within the narrative to achieve a goal or face consequences. For example, this prisoner must be saved before this date because they are scheduled for execution. This character must make it until dawn because only then will they have an escape from some vampires. Or the obvious one, for which the device gets its namesake, this bomb must be defused before the ticking clock timer on it reaches 0 and it explodes. Though it can be more complex than this. In most cases, the ticking clock is a kind of countdown that creates tension from the question of can these characters achieve X before Y happens. Tension is increased as the scenario grows closer to the point of no return, but ultimately the goal is to draw out that tension until the last second, only to have the wedding stop just before it's made official, the lead to get home just in time for Christmas, or the correct wire get cut with only 1 second to spare. With the coffee table, the dread of the ticking clock is inescapable, not because there's a way to fix things before the worst possible outcome, but because the worst case scenario is truly inevitable. Maria will find out what has happened to her son. It is just a case of when. And this changes every remaining second of the movie after that glass smashes with the horrible feeling of this is the moment. This is when the horrible reality of the situation all comes crashing down for everybody. No matter how hard Jesus tries to hide what has happened, their world is forever broken. All he can do is delay that reality for her, but he cannot delay it forever. It's a truly overwhelming feeling that's genuinely hard to sit with, and it's a big reason why I can't stop thinking about the film and why I wanted to talk about it at all. There's no denying that The Coffee Table is a cruel, relentlessly bleak and nihilistic film. It is, in essence, as followers of this channel will know, everything I often don't like in horror. You'd be excused for looking at this premise and thinking it another of the kind of garishly edgy slop that sometimes plagues the extreme label of that genre, a kind of artless exercise in misery that has nothing to offer other than its shock value. But the thing with The Coffee Table is, 1, there is a real masterful craft on display, and 2, as I've already mentioned a few times, no doubt to the confusion of many of you listening, it isn't even trying to be that kind of extreme exploitation horror movie. It's a comedy, a black comedy to be sure, but it falls under the comedy label nevertheless. Regardless of its ghastly subject matter, I think The Coffee Table is a genuinely interesting and compelling film. Not one I'd recommend per se, not one I even would necessarily argue that I enjoyed, but definitely one that's hard to shake after witnessing it, and something with a bit more to it than a quick gasp. For one thing, the film is, despite what you might think, extremely light on gore. A lesser filmmaker might relish in those details, dangling the senseless viscera of it all in front of the camera lens with a gross voyeurism for cheap, exploitative horror. But Casas and his team are far smarter than that, leaving everything besides some cut hands and some bloody drips and trails in the imagination of the audience. A more subtle approach that is far more nightmarish than the tacky and tasteless alternative. The film is an almost methodical exercise in creating tension. From the death onwards, every element on screen is in constant cooperation with one another, concentrated solely on the efforts of making you squirm. There's this creeping, slow camera movement juxtaposed with these instances of more panicked handheld camera motions that, when paired with the cast's truly exceptional performances, really bring you into the sense of total despair. It's like this 1-2 punch, the slower, more deliberate movement building an uncomfortable anticipation, and then the handheld stuff putting you firmly within their worst nightmares. The acting and performances emanate with a palpable, nerve-shredding anxiety, complemented by writing that constantly places these characters, especially Jesus, at the end of their tethers. You know that saying about the elephant in the room? That awkward feeling when something really obvious is hanging over a social situation but no one is addressing it? Now imagine the elephant is a dead baby and you've got 90% of the scenes that take place in this movie. Every single small moment is overcharged with an electric energy of unease. Dinner party small talk that would, in any other context, make for dull, lifeless filler suddenly become these taut psychological minefields when one of the leads is fighting for his life trying to keep the most horrible secret in the world and the audience knows it. What to others looks like angry, erratic, antisocial behaviour takes on the life of a ticking time bomb you're just waiting to explode with a truth that will shatter everyone in the room when you as an audience are watching a man wrestle and begin to lose the fight to wear a mask of normality in the most abnormal situation. And the longer Jesus keeps up the act, the more that mask slips and the worse the fear becomes. You find yourself begging, pleading for him to just come clean, because as awful as it will be when Maria discovers what has happened, and you know it will be horrendous, every second he tries to hide what has happened is more unbearable than the last. And the film knows this and rolls into it. Every line where Maria vocalizes how much she loves her son is like a knife in your heart. Every joke she makes about the table smashing, a twisted, cruel joke upon herself. Every casual conversation with people about their families, a bitter, poisoned pill. And the film takes all of this energy, all of this dread and tension and anxiety, and builds up to a climax that, while I won't explain here for those of you brave or foolish enough to desire to endure this thing yourself, I will say is just about the single worst way imaginable this already horrible scenario could resolve. Dear God, this movie will take it out of you. So you might be wondering, Dan, Mr. Drambles, how in the ever-loving hell is this in any way remotely a comedy? Fair question, though for me, I totally see why it fits the label. I'm not saying it's a barrel of laughs, it isn't, but as far as black comedy goes, it certainly is undeniably farcical. I mean, break this film down to its core and you have an earth-shattering moment of brutal tragedy, and what does it all stem from? A tacky ass, ugly as sin coffee table. Every terrible, awful, cruel thing that happens to the characters within this movie all stems from a husband's stubborn decision to buy a table with boobies on it, just because his wife told him not to. That is, in some mean-spirited way, kind of funny. Like, come on, that is hilariously grim. And the film, though I would argue rides its horror and tension far more obviously than its comedy elements, never really lets the silliness and absurdity of this whole thing go. When Jesus eventually gets the screw from that sleazy salesman that supposedly would have gave the table the rigidity to make it unbreakable, it is mere moments after tragedy is struck. This tiny little screw, a screw that should have been in the original packaging and that would have meant the table was assembled and not placed as a dangerous tripping hazard, arrives about 2 minutes too late, like an additional punchline to the cruel joke of it all. And not only that, but the salesman and everyone around Jesus still exist in a world he now does not, the world of the trivial monotony, of the everyday, of the meaningless nothings, and Jesus has to interact with this world from outside of it, such as when the salesman won't leave because he insists on Jesus entering a raffle for a crappy electric fan. One the salesman insists with a knowing wink he will rig in Jesus's favour, as if the promise of a cheap consumer fan would ever help Jesus now. But nevertheless, he has to keep up appearances and lean over and allow the salesman to fill out his details on his back while covered in his own child's blood. A truly farcical display. There's something bleakly comedic to this. The idea of this man whose world has just ended being forced to still partake in the mundanity of it all, of telling neighbours the blood on his hands is from decorating, of borrowing bleach to rid the evidence of a grisly scene under the guise of cleaning, of listening to all the middling small talk of dinner guests and still having to deal with the unwanted advances of the 13-year-old upstairs crushing on him. It's an insane situation, and there is a comedic edge to be found within that. But the question for me is, what is the value of that? It might be comedic on paper, but it's not exactly going to make you laugh. So why approach it this way? Why make this part of the quote-unquote joke? And this is where I argue that this is 100% a horror film. It is exactly this comedy element that enhances the horror of it all. This darkly playful juxtaposition between the triviality of furniture shopping, bickering couples, annoying neighbours and pushy salesmen against one of the truly darkest tragedies imaginable only further highlights just how awful the inciting death actually is, and the shocking, cruel, relentlessly bleak ending I alluded to earlier once again pairs this notion of silly farce with abject horror. It is interestingly a kind of silly thing that happens which leads to the inevitable discovery you spend the whole film waiting for. But it is precisely because of this sort of ridiculous outcome that it leaves such a disturbing impact that, for me specifically, it became the first instance in which I have cried at a film in pure shock alone. I didn't even realise I was doing it. I just held my hand to my mouth in complete disbelief for the entire final scene, and when the credits rolled, I realised I had tears. That is not an emotional reaction you can facilitate with edginess alone. The coffee table isn't funny, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a comedy. A comedy that makes way for one of the most affecting horror films you could possibly witness. Lots of horror goes to dark places, but The Coffee Table feels like true terror, a genuine nightmare, an outright violation. And while I certainly can't recommend the viewing experience, it is crafted with such sinister skill, with such morbid design, and such legitimate discomfort that I can't honestly say there's not something there I find to appreciate in that. Anyway, that's all from me. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell for more vids like this. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Hey, Patreon shoutouts! Apologies that I haven't done these in a while, that's just because the last couple of videos have been really time sensitive, so I had to get them out quick, but I got time here on this one, so this video I'd like to give a shout out to Sarah Reichert, Garudina, and Festy Dog. If you'd like to become a patron and get access to some exclusive vids, a Discord channel, other cool stuff, and a chance to get your own name shouted out and appear in the credits of the vids alongside all the other lovely folks you're seeing on screen right now, then you can do so at patreon.com/DanDrambles. And if you're coming from this video, I'd especially appreciate that because I have a sneaky suspicion that for some reason this one might get demonetized based on the subject matter. Just got a little feeling on that one. Big thanks to everyone who has become a patron so far, and I've already said this, but whatever, I can't think of another way to sign off, so please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next video.